My king, please don't bury me, no, no. Let the earth take me, but mark my words, this land will never know peace again. The innocent will suffer as I have suffered. The heavens will curse this kingdom for what it has done. You will all pay for this injustice. Ada had always known what it meant to struggle. Orphaned at a young age, she had no father to turn to, no family to help her. But she had something that mattered more to her than anything in the world: her mother. Her mother, Mama Titi, had been blind for as long as Ada could remember. When she was little, Ada would sit beside her mother's bed, holding her hand as they talked about the world beyond their little cottage. Mama Titi would describe things Ada couldn't see: the blue sky, the bright sun, the colors of the flowers in their garden. But as Ada grew older, the burden of care fell squarely on her shoulders. Every day she worked tirelessly to make sure her mother was taken care of. She cooked meals, cleaned the house, and tended to their small garden. There was no one else to help. Ada didn't mind. She loved her mother dearly. But life was not easy. Their little cottage was old and worn. The walls were cracked and the roof leaked when it rained. The village they lived in was far from the bustling city, and work was hard to come by. Ada often went to bed hungry, but she would always make sure her mother had enough to eat. Her mother's needs always came first. One day, when Ada was 15, she heard news that would change their lives forever. The royal palace had begun hiring workers. They needed maids and servants to work in the grand halls of the king's court. Ada, though hesitant at first, knew this could be her only chance for a better life. Perhaps, just perhaps, she could earn enough to care for her mother and even give her a more comfortable life. So she made the difficult decision to apply. She had nothing to lose. The day she received the letter from the palace was a day she would never forget. She ran home, clutching the paper in her hands. "Mama," she cried, rushing into the small cottage. "Mama, look, I got the job." Mama Titi, who could no longer see the joy in her daughter's face, smiled warmly. "That's wonderful, my dear. You've always worked hard. I knew something good would come your way." Ada hugged her mother tightly, but deep inside she was nervous. The palace was far away and she would have to leave her mother behind, but her mother's encouragement gave her strength. Ada moved into the palace, leaving her small cottage behind. It was hard at first. She missed her mother terribly and worried about her every day, but she knew it was for the best. The palace was breathtaking. It was so different from the small cottage she had left behind. There were glittering chandeliers, long corridors filled with paintings, and rooms filled with the finest furniture. She had never seen anything so grand. Ada was given a modest room in the servant quarters, and she worked hard from dawn until dusk. She cleaned the queen's chambers, prepared meals, and served the royal family. Although the work was exhausting, Ada found joy in knowing she was earning a living and taking care of her mother from afar. But there was one thing she hadn't expected: the prince. Prince Olumide had been away, studying abroad for many years, and the whole kingdom had waited eagerly for his return. When he finally arrived, the entire palace buzzed with excitement. Ada was no exception. She had heard stories about him. The prince, who was known for his kindness, his charm, and his intelligence. But Ada had never imagined she would meet him. She was just a maid, after all. One afternoon, while Ada was working in the royal garden, the prince passed by. She was bent over picking flowers when she heard footsteps behind her. She looked up, and there he was, Prince Olumide. He smiled at her. "You have a beautiful garden here," he said. "It must take a lot of work." Ada froze, unsure of what to say. The prince was speaking to her, a simple maid. "Thank you, your highness," she stammered, bowing her head respectfully. The prince laughed softly. "No need to bow. You're part of this palace just like everyone else." Ada looked up at him, her heart beating faster. There was something in his eyes, something that made her feel both nervous and warm. From that day, their conversations became a regular occurrence. The prince would often pass by the garden and talk to Ada, asking her about her life, about her work, and about her blind mother. Although Ada was always polite and humble, she couldn't help but feel a connection growing between them. The prince was different from everyone else. He seemed to see her not just as a maid, but as someone who mattered. A few weeks passed, and Prince Olumide's affection for Ada became more obvious. He would find excuses to speak with her, always asking about her mother, about how she was adjusting to life in the palace. The other maids began to notice. Some were happy for Ada, but others, especially Amina, Bose, and Funmi, were not. They had worked at the palace for years, and none of them had ever received the prince's attention. Why was he so interested in this new maid? The whispers started. Why her? Amina asked one evening as the three of them gathered in the servant quarters. Why not us? We've been here for years. Bose crossed her arms. She must be using tricks. Maybe she's acting innocent to catch the prince's eye. Funmi shook her head. I don't care what she's doing, but I know one thing. The prince will never choose a maid over us. And so, the three of them began to scheme. They would make sure Ada's stay in the palace didn't last much longer. They couldn't let her steal what they had dreamed of for so long. Days turned into weeks, and with each passing day, Prince Olumide's interest in Ada grew stronger. He would find excuses to walk through the palace gardens, making sure to pass by where Ada worked. They would exchange polite words at first, then linger a little longer each time, talking more openly about their lives. But what truly began to surprise Ada was that the prince didn't just ask about her. He was genuinely interested in her life, her struggles, her past. He wanted to know about her blind mother, who lived far away in the cottage, and about how Ada managed to care for her. I cannot imagine how difficult it must be to care for someone who cannot see, Prince Olumide had said one afternoon, his eyes filled with empathy. I know I could never do it. Ada had smiled softly. My mother is everything to me, even though she cannot see. I know she feels everything. She feels my love, my care. That is enough for her. There was something comforting about the way the prince spoke, as if he truly understood the burden of caring for someone in need. It was different from the casual conversations Ada had with others in the palace. With Prince Olumide, it felt like a genuine connection, one that went beyond their different positions in life. One day, after a long conversation about their childhoods, the prince surprised Ada with a question she never expected. Ada, he said, his voice gentle, may I meet your mother? Ada froze. She hadn't expected that. The prince, heir to the throne, wanted to meet her blind mother? My mother, she asked, her voice shaky. Why would you want to meet her? She isn't like the women you know. She's blind, and she lives far from the palace in a small cottage. The prince smiled as though he'd been expecting her hesitation. I want to meet her because I care about you, Ada. I want to understand your life better. And I know that your mother is a part of it, a very important part. Ada was taken aback by his sincerity. No one had ever shown such kindness or interest in her family before, especially not a prince. She didn't know how to respond. What would her mother think of him? What would the village think if the prince came to their humble home? But in the end, she knew she couldn't refuse him. It was clear that the prince cared deeply for her and wanted to get to know her better, and so she agreed. All right, she said quietly, looking down at the ground. I'll take you to her, but please understand that our home is simple. It's not like the palace. I don't need luxury, the prince replied with a grin. I just want to meet the woman who raised you. The next afternoon, Prince Olumide arrived at the gates of the palace, waiting for Ada to lead him to her mother's cottage. She was nervous about what her mother would think, nervous about what the villagers would say. But as they walked through the village together, she felt the weight of his presence beside her. The prince walked casually, as though he was any other person, and Ada found herself growing more comfortable with his company. When they finally reached the small, worn cottage where Ada and her mother lived, the prince took a deep breath and smiled at Ada. This is it? He asked, looking at the humble home. Ada nodded, a little embarrassed. Yes, it's small, but it's home. As they entered the cottage, Mama Titi was sitting by the window, her hands resting in her lap. She was humming softly, a peaceful sound that Ada had always loved. When she heard the door open, she turned her head slightly. "Is that you, Ada?" Her voice was gentle, though it lacked the sharpness of sight. "Yes, Mama," Ada replied, her voice filled with warmth. "I've brought someone with me today." At that moment, the prince stepped forward. "Hello, Mama Titi," he said softly, smiling down at her. "I'm Prince Olumide. It's a great honor to meet you." Mama Titi's face lit up with a smile, even though she couldn't see the prince. A prince? My daughter talks about you often. I'm so glad to meet you." Her voice was full of kindness, as if she had known him for years. Prince Olumide knelt down beside her, his eyes full of respect. "I've heard so much about you, Mama Titi. Ada speaks so highly of you. It's clear that you have raised her with so much love." Ada blushed, grateful for the kindness in the prince's words. "She's the strongest woman I know," she said, her voice full of affection for her mother. As the prince spent time talking with Mama Titi, Ada realized just how genuine he was. He didn't speak to her like she was some fragile, blind old woman. He spoke to her as if she were just as important as anyone in the palace. He asked her about her life, her dreams, and even about her childhood, listening carefully to every word. Ada watched them, her heart swelling with warmth. She had never seen her mother so happy, so comfortable with someone outside their little family. The prince's presence seemed to bring a sense of peace to her home, and Ada couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude toward him. After a while, the prince stood up, taking a final moment to look around the cottage. "Thank you, Mama Titi, for letting me into your home. It's been a great honor to meet you." Mama Titi smiled warmly. "You are welcome, Your Highness. I know Ada is very fond of you, and that means a lot to me." The prince smiled at Ada. "You are very lucky, Ada," he said, his voice low and sincere. "Your mother is a wonderful woman." Ada felt a lump form in her throat, a mix of happiness and emotion. She had always known how special her mother was, but hearing the prince speak so kindly of her made her heart swell with pride. "Thank you, Your Highness," Ada said, bowing her head slightly. "You're too kind." As they left the cottage, the prince took Ada's hand gently. "I'll see you again soon," he said, his voice soft. Ada nodded, feeling a strange warmth spread through her chest. The prince's kindness toward her mother meant more to her than words could express, and as they walked back to the palace, she knew that their bond was deepening, becoming something she hadn't expected, but was slowly beginning to cherish. The days following the prince's visit to Ada's cottage were filled with a strange mix of excitement and dread. Ada couldn't help but feel a sense of warmth whenever she thought about the prince's kindness toward her mother. It felt like a dream that someone as important as Prince Olamide would care so much about her humble life. But at the same time, a growing unease settled in her heart, for she knew that the other maids in the palace had begun to take notice. As Ada continued her duties in the palace, she felt the sharp eyes of the other maids following her wherever she went. The whispers had started quietly, but they were already spreading like wildfire. "Did you hear about Ada?" Amina's voice was sharp and filled with suspicion, her eyes scanning the room for anyone who might be listening. Bose nodded, her arms crossed as she leaned against the doorway. "I saw her with the prince the other day. They were walking together, alone. I thought she was just a maid, but now it seems like she's got the prince's attention." Funmi snorted, her voice dripping with bitterness. "What does she have that we don't? She's just an orphan, no family, no wealth. Yet, he treats her like she's special." Amina's face twisted with jealousy. "It's ridiculous. We've been here for years, but now she comes in and suddenly the prince is falling all over her. He even went to her home. What does she think she is?" They all laughed darkly, exchanging glances of agreement. "I don't like it," Boo said quietly, her eyes narrowing. "She's got something going on with him, something we don't know about." Funmi grinned, her eyes gleaming with malice. "We need to keep an eye on her. If the prince wants her so badly, maybe we should remind him of who she really is. Just a poor maid, someone who doesn't belong with someone like him." The three of them laughed again, their faces cold with spite. The next day, as Ada worked in the royal gardens, she overheard a conversation between two other maids. They were talking in low voices, but their words pierced through her like daggers. "I heard she's been spending time with the prince," one of the maids whispered. "They say he's been visiting her mother. Can you believe it?" "I knew she was trouble the moment she arrived," the other maid replied. "There's no way she could be trusted. She's just using him to get what she wants." Ada's heart sank. The whispers were louder now, and she could see the judgment in the eyes of the other maids as they passed by. They were talking about her, and it wasn't in a kind way. As Ada passed the group of maids later that afternoon, she caught a few of them glaring at her, their eyes full of disdain and contempt. Her stomach twisted with discomfort. She had always tried to stay out of trouble, but now it seemed like her every move was being watched, judged, and twisted into something that wasn't true. "Don't you think the prince's attention is a little too much for someone like her?" one of the maids said, her voice loud enough for Ada to hear. Ada's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself, but she couldn't. She didn't have the energy to argue with them. The prince was kind to her. There was nothing wrong with that. But the jealousy in their eyes made her feel small and insignificant. She had no idea what she had done to deserve their hatred. All she had ever done was work hard and care for her mother. Later that evening, as Ada was cleaning the queen's chambers, she overheard Amina, Bose, and Funmi whispering behind a curtain. The words were clear. Too clear. "I told you," Amina hissed. "She's up to something with the prince. No one gets that kind of attention without a reason." Fomi's eyes sparkled with cruel amusement. "The prince has fallen for her tricks, and when he figures out what she really is, it will be too late." Bose shook her head. "He'll never listen to us. He's blinded by her innocence. We need to show him the truth, who she really is." "What if we told the queen?" Amina suggested. "She knows the prince listens to her. If we make the queen see what kind of woman Ada really is, maybe the prince will finally come to his senses." Funmi smiled. "That's a good idea. If the queen hears enough about this little maid who's trying to trap her son, she might just put an end to all of this." The three of them exchanged knowing looks, plotting their next move. Ada had no idea that her world was about to crumble further, that the gossiping and lies would only grow stronger. But the maids had made up their minds. Ada's time in the palace was running out. The next day, the queen invited Ada to her private chambers. Ada, nervous and uncertain, obeyed, wondering what this meeting could possibly be about. When she entered, the queen was sitting in a plush armchair by the window, looking as regal as always, but there was something different in her eyes, a sharpness, a coolness that made Ada's stomach tighten. "Sit, Ada," the queen said, her voice soft but commanding. Ada sat across from her, hands nervously clasped in her lap. She wondered if the queen had heard the gossip, wondered if she had already made up her mind about her. "You've been spending a lot of time with my son lately," the queen said, her eyes watching Ada carefully. "I'm curious. What is your true intention here, Ada?" Ada blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Your Majesty, I don't know what you mean." The queen raised an eyebrow. "You know exactly what I mean. My son is a prince, Ada, and you are a maid." Ada's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to explain. She wanted to tell the queen that she had never sought the prince's attention, that she cared for him only as a friend. But the jealous whispers of the other maids echoed in her mind. Was the queen already convinced she was trying to trap him? "I assure you, Your Majesty, I am only doing my work," Ada said, her voice trembling. "The prince is kind, and I respect him. I have no other intentions." The queen stared at her for a long moment, her eyes piercing. "You should be careful, Ada. I don't want any trouble in my palace. And if you think you can manipulate my son, I'll make sure you're sent far away from here." Ada felt a cold sweat break out across her forehead. Was the queen already suspicious of her? Had the gossip already reached her ears? Before Ada could respond, the queen dismissed her with a wave of her hand. "You may go now, but remember what I said." As Ada left the queen's chambers, She couldn't shake the feeling that everything was falling apart. The days seemed to blur together for Ada as the whispers around the palace grew louder. Her every movement was watched, her every step observed. Despite the growing tension between her and the other maids, there was one constant, the prince's kind attention. But it wasn't just the prince who had taken notice of her. King Adewale, the ruler of the land, had also observed Ada closely over the past few weeks. He saw her work tirelessly, always with grace and humility. He saw how she treated everyone with respect, never letting the hierarchy of the palace get in the way of her kindness. One evening, while Ada was cleaning the royal garden, the king took a walk through the grounds, his regal figure moving with purpose. He had heard the rumors, the gossip of the maids, but he saw something different in Ada. When he passed her, Ada curtsied quickly, her head down in respect. The king stopped, a smile forming on his lips. He had seen many servants come and go, but something about Ada made her stand out. "You work hard, Ada," the king said kindly. "I've been watching you, and I must say, I'm impressed. Your efforts are not unnoticed." Ada's heart skipped a beat. The king? Complimenting her? She had never expected such words from someone as important as him. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she said, her voice soft with gratitude. "I just want to do my best, to serve the palace well." "You do more than that," the king said, looking at her with a gleam in his eyes. "You've shown that you are not just a servant, but a person of integrity, a decent woman." The word struck Ada deeply. She had always thought of herself as just a maid, nothing more, but to hear the king call her decent, to hear him recognize her for her character, made her feel seen for the first time in her life. "Thank you, Your Majesty," Ada said, bowing her head, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility. "I'm glad you're here, Ada. I think you'll go far in this palace," the king added, a smile crossing his face as he walked away. As the king disappeared around the corner, Ada stood there for a moment, her mind racing. The king had noticed her. Back in the servants' quarters, the maids had been watching the scene unfold. They had seen the king and Ada's conversation, and it only fueled the fire of their jealousy. "This is getting out of hand," Amina hissed, her eyes burning with anger. "First, it's the prince. Now the king is paying attention to her? What does she think she is?" Bose crossed her arms tightly, her lips curling in frustration. "She's just a maid. She's nothing special. Why is everyone so interested in her?" Funmi scoffed, her eyes narrowed. "We've worked in this palace for years, yet it's this orphan girl who gets all the attention. It's not fair. We can't let this continue." Amina's eyes gleamed with a cold, calculating look. "We need to stop her, before the king takes her as his own." Bose nodded slowly. "What do you mean?" Amina leaned in closer, speaking in a low, dangerous whisper. "We make sure she's discredited. We show the king that she's nothing but a troublemaker. If we can get her to fall from grace, he will stop paying attention to her." Funmi grinned, "And we'll be back in the prince's favor. The king won't care about some lowly maid when he sees the truth about her." The three maids gathered together, their eyes glinting with wicked intent. Their plan was set in motion. The next day, Ada was cleaning the royal dining hall when she noticed the maids watching her, their eyes full of silent judgment. She tried to ignore it, focusing on her work, but the tension in the air was thick. She felt like they were waiting for her to slip up. As she wiped down the large dining table, a loud crash suddenly echoed through the room. Ada looked up to find a silver platter that had been knocked to the ground, its contents spilled all over the floor. It was a precious piece of the royal tableware, and Ada knew immediately that it was the queen's favorite platter. "Oh no," Ada muttered, rushing to clean up the mess. But before she could pick up the pieces, Amina, Bose, and Funmi entered the room. Their eyes immediately fell on the broken platter, and the malicious smiles on their faces only grew wider. "What do we have here?" Amina said sweetly, though her voice dripped with sarcasm. "A broken platter? How did that happen, Ada?" Ada's face flushed with embarrassment. I didn't mean to. It slipped from my hands." "Oh, I'm sure it did," Bo said, her voice cold. "But you're always so clumsy, Ada. What do you think the king will say when he hears about this? Funmi crossed her arms, looking at the broken pieces with disdain. You should be careful. A mistake like this could cost you your position in the palace. Ada's heart sank. She had never meant to break the platter, but now it seemed as if her every move was being scrutinized. As Ada knelt down to clean the mess, she could hear the maid's whispers, just loud enough for her to hear. She's getting too close to the prince, Amina muttered. She thinks she can just waltz into this palace and get everything she wants. Well, we're going to make sure she knows her place, Funmi whispered. We'll make sure the king sees that she's nothing more than a clumsy maid. Ada's hands trembled as she continued to pick up the broken pieces. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, but she knew she had to remain calm. If she let them see her panic, it would only make things worse. Later that evening, when Ada returned to her quarters, she felt the weight of the day's events weighing heavily on her. But just as she sat down to rest, a royal servant arrived with a message. The king requests your presence, the servant said, bowing respectfully. You are to join him in the royal garden at once. Ada's heart skipped a beat. The king? He wanted to see her again? She couldn't imagine why after everything that had happened, but she didn't have time to question it. As she walked through the grand halls of the palace, Ada couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. She had always been careful to stay out of the way, but now with the king's attention on her, things were different. When she reached the garden, the king was standing by the fountain, his regal presence filling the space. He smiled warmly when he saw her approach. Ah, Ada, I'm glad you could join me, the king said. I wanted to speak with you about something important. Ada bowed her head respectfully. What is it, Your Majesty? You've proven yourself to be a woman of great integrity and work ethic. I've been watching you closely and I am impressed. You have earned my trust and respect. Ada's heart swelled with gratitude. The king trusted her. After everything that had happened, this was a sign that there was still hope for her. But as the king continued to speak, Ada had no idea that the maids were still watching, plotting, and waiting for the right moment to strike. The tension in the palace had been growing thicker each day. Ada could feel it in the air, the whispers, the glances, the coldness from the other maids. They watched her like hawks, their eyes filled with jealousy and resentment. But despite the mounting pressure, she remained focused on her duties, doing her best to serve the royal family with kindness and respect. However, Ada had no idea that a dangerous plan was unfolding right under her nose, a plan that would not only put her in grave danger but would also test her very place in the palace. It started on an ordinary day when the queen's gold jewelry was on display for everyone to see. The queen had received a precious set of jewelry, a beautiful gold chain and a sparkling bracelet, both bought by her son, Prince Ulumide, as a birthday gift. The set was not just expensive, it was irreplaceable, a token of love and admiration from the prince for his mother. The queen treasured these pieces more than anything else. She wore them every day, and the palace servants had been instructed to take extra care whenever handling her precious belongings. These were no ordinary jewels. They were symbols of the prince's affection and the queen's status. To her, they were priceless, but for the jealous maids, Amina, Bose, and Funmi, the gold chain and bracelet represented something more. They saw them as a way to take Ada down. That morning, the maids gathered in a quiet corner of the servants' quarters. They knew the queen's jewelry had been displayed in her room all week, and they saw this as their one chance to rid themselves of Ada once and for all. We can't let her get any closer to the prince, Amina whispered, her voice dripping with venom. If the king favors her and the prince keeps watching her, we're done for. She has to be stopped. Bose gritted her teeth. But how do we do that? She's so careful, and she doesn't do anything wrong. She'll never slip up. Funmu's face twisted into a sly grin. That's where we come in. We create the slip-up for her. Amina and Bose exchanged wary glances. What do you mean? Bose asked. Funmi leaned in, lowering her voice to a whisper. We steal the queen's jewelry. The very one Prince Illumide gave her. It's perfect. We hide it, and then Ada is the one who'll be blamed. The two maids stared at Funmi in shock, but but then a wicked smile began to creep across their faces. "That's brilliant," Amina said, her voice cold. "She'll be blamed for something she didn't do, and there will be no way for her to defend herself." "Exactly," Funmi said, her eyes gleaming. "We'll make sure she's caught in the act. The queen will have no choice but to believe she took it." Bose nodded, already imagining the satisfaction of watching Ada crumble under the pressure. "We've been careful, but now is the time to act. Let's do this." The plan was set. It was risky, but they didn't care. Ada had to go. Later that afternoon, the queen's room was left unattended. The maids knew this would be their only opportunity to execute their plan. Amina, Bose, and Funmi slipped into the queen's private chambers, moving quickly and quietly. The queen's gold chain and bracelet lay on the dressing table, gleaming in the soft afternoon light. The sight of the precious jewels made the maids' hearts race. They knew how much the queen loved them, and the thought of taking them made them feel both powerful and daring. Amina approached the dressing table first. She reached out and carefully picked up the gold chain, her fingers trembling slightly with excitement. It was even more beautiful than she had imagined, and she could already feel the power it gave her. "Quickly, put it in your bag," Bose urged, her voice low. Funmi watched the door, making sure no one was coming. "Be careful. We don't want anyone to see us." With one swift motion, Amina slipped the gold chain into her bag. She then reached for the bracelet. It was delicate, with diamonds sparkling in the light, and as she lifted it from the table, a feeling of triumph rushed through her. "We'll hide them well," Amina said, her voice gleaming with satisfaction. "No one will suspect us. And when Ada is blamed, she'll be gone from the palace." Finally, Funmi and Bose exchanged looks of approval, but just as they were about to leave, a sound echoed from the hallway. They froze. Footsteps. It was Ada. Ada had been assigned to clean the queen's chambers that afternoon. She had just finished the royal dining hall and moved on to the queen's room. She didn't suspect anything unusual, as she had been in the queen's room countless times before, always doing her work with the utmost care and respect. But as she entered, she immediately noticed the maids standing near the dressing table, their backs turned, trying to hide the bag they were holding. Something didn't feel right. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know you were here," Ada said, trying to sound polite as she stepped back to give them space. Amina quickly tried to cover her actions, her face betraying no sign of what had just happened. "Oh, Ada, you're here already," she said with a forced smile. "We were just leaving. The queen wanted some fresh flowers in the garden. You can finish up here." Ada nodded, sensing their unease, but thinking nothing of it. She assumed they were simply rushing to do another task. As she stepped into the room to finish her cleaning, she heard the maids hurry down the hallway, their footsteps growing faint. It wasn't until hours later, when the queen returned to her chambers, that Ada's life would change forever. The queen, who had been away for a meeting, stepped into her room with a look of horror on her face. "Where is it?" she cried, her voice rising in panic as she looked around the room. She rushed to her dressing table, her hands trembling as she searched for her gold chain and bracelet. "It was here just this morning. Where are my jewels?" The queen's voice was filled with rage, and in that moment, Ada's heart sank. She had no idea what had happened. I don't know, Your Majesty," Ada stammered, trying to make sense of the situation. "I didn't see them. I've only just started cleaning your room. Maybe they were moved or misplaced." The queen's eyes narrowed. "No, you were the last one in here." Her voice dropped low, dangerous. "I'll make sure you pay for this, Ada. You've stolen my precious jewels." Ada gasped, her mind reeling. She hadn't touched anything. She had only cleaned as she was supposed to, but the evidence seemed stacked against her. The queen's anger was blinding, and Ada knew there was no way to explain herself. The news spread quickly throughout the palace. Ada, the trusted maid, was now accused of stealing the queen's gold chain and bracelet. Despite her protests of innocence, the maid stood in silence, watching as the blame was placed solely on her. Amina, Bose, and Funmi exchanged glances, their hearts filled with twisted satisfaction. They had succeeded. Ada had been framed. Ada's heart pounded in her chest as she was dragged into the royal chambers, trembling and broken. Her whole life was about to change in an instant. There was no way out. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the palace courtyard as Ada stood before the royal court. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a loud reminder that everything she had known was now slipping away. The rumors had spread like wildfire. The queen's precious jewels, her son's gift, had been stolen, and the one who was accused of the crime was none other than Ada. The queen, her face tight with fury, sat on her golden throne, eyes glaring at Ada with suspicion and disbelief. The council of elders, the kingdom's most respected men, stood beside her. They were the final authority in this land, and their word was law. The king, who had been watching from a distance, sat silently at the head of the council. His face was unreadable, his expression cold, and his silence was more painful than any words could have been. He had always believed in justice, but now his heart was torn. Ada had been brought before them, trembling, her hands bound in rope, her head hung low. She wanted to speak, to tell them the truth, to tell them that she hadn't taken the jewelry, that she had done nothing wrong. But her voice was choked with fear. What was the point? The evidence seemed damning, and she knew the kingdom's laws well. In this community, stealing was a crime punishable by death. Not just any death, but a horrifying end. According to the ancient law, any thief who was caught would be buried alive. It was a brutal and unforgiving punishment, meant to serve as a warning to anyone who dared to break the law. Ada had never imagined she would be the one to face it. The room was silent as the council debated, but it felt as though the walls themselves were closing in on Ada. She could feel the eyes of the council upon her, but the words they spoke made no sense. She couldn't focus on their voices. She couldn't breathe. "The evidence is clear," one elder said, his voice low and gruff. "The stolen jewelry was found in her possession. She was the last person to clean the queen's room. There can be no mistake." Ada's heart sank and she tried to steady her breath. She hadn't stolen anything. She didn't even know how the jewelry had ended up in her quarters. But nobody believed her. One of the other elders spoke, his voice softer but filled with authority. "The law must be upheld. If we make exceptions now, it will undermine everything we stand for. Our kingdom has lived by these laws for centuries. We cannot allow one person's mistake to destroy everything." The queen, who had been silent up until now, spoke in a sharp voice that cut through the air. "The punishment for theft is clear," she said, her eyes cold and unforgiving. "She must be buried alive. There is no room for mercy in this matter." Ada's mind went numb. Buried alive? It was the most horrific punishment, one she had heard of in the distant past but had never believed she would face. The thought of suffocating under the weight of the earth, alone and helpless, filled her with absolute terror. But still, she didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The prince, who had been standing at the back of the room, watching the proceedings with growing horror, could no longer stay silent. He stepped forward, his face pale, his voice shaking with anger and despair. "Father!" Prince Olumide's voice rang out, sharp and desperate. "This isn't right. Ada is innocent. I know her. I've spoken to her. She would never steal from the queen. She has no reason to—" The king's eyes flashed with warning, and for a brief moment, there was silence. The prince's heart was pounding in his chest as he took another step forward, ignoring the looks of disapproval from the council. "Please, father, you know this law is harsh. You've seen the evidence against her. There is no way she could have stolen those jewels." The prince's eyes were filled with desperation as he looked from his father to the council. The king's gaze was cold and his voice was quiet but firm. "The law must be carried out, Olumide. The law is the law. We cannot allow personal feelings to interfere with justice." "No!" the prince shouted, his fists clenching at his sides. "I cannot stand by and watch an innocent woman die for a crime she did not commit." But the king's eyes remained stern and his voice did not waver. "I understand your feelings, my son, but the law is clear, and it must be followed." At the back of the room, Amina, Bose, and Funmi stood together. their faces filled with satisfaction. They had watched the entire scene unfold, their expressions hidden behind masks of false sorrow. "I told you it would work," Amina whispered to the other two. "She didn't stand a chance." Bose nodded, her eyes glinting with a cold, triumphant gleam. "We've finally gotten rid of her. She was a threat, and now she's nothing. The prince will turn to us now." Funmi smiled, her face almost cruel in its satisfaction. "Ada's death will be the price she pays for getting in our way. We've won." The three maids exchanged glances, their smiles hidden beneath their carefully constructed faces. They knew that once Ada was buried, there would be no one left to stand in their way. The prince, the king, they would all be forced to turn to them. The royal decree was given and Ada's fate was sealed. Guards were quickly summoned to escort her to the place of execution. She walked with heavy steps, her heart numb from the crushing weight of despair. Everything had happened so fast. She didn't want to die, she wasn't ready. She had so much to live for, but there was no escape now. No one believed her. The queen's voice echoed in her mind, her cold words condemning her to an unimaginable end. Buried alive. The journey to the burial site was long and silent. Ada's heart felt like it was breaking with each step she took toward her doom. She was not a thief, but the world had already made up its mind about her. She couldn't escape it. The air was thick with tension, each breath harder to take than the last. Ada could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her as she was led to the burial site, her wrists bound tightly by rough ropes. She tried to lift her head, but the grief she felt was too much. Every step felt heavier than the one before, and the crushing reality of what was happening slowly sunk in. Buried alive, the words echoed in her mind as she walked toward the pit, where guards stood ready to carry out the punishment. The whole kingdom knew the law, and no one dared challenge it. The punishment for theft was death, and she had been accused of something she didn't do. The weight of injustice felt unbearable. As the cold wind swept through the royal courtyard, Ada's thoughts raced. She wanted to cry, to scream, to beg for mercy, but her body was numb, her voice weak. How had her life come to this? "Please." The words escaped Ada's lips before she could stop them, her voice hoarse and filled with desperation. "Please, let me see my mother one last time." The guards who had been silently marching her toward her fate paused. They exchanged glances, uncertain of what to do. It was rare for someone to make a last request before meeting their end, especially one as simple as seeing a loved one one last time. The sound of Ada's voice, raw with grief, broke through the coldness of the moment. The queen, standing nearby, her face as cold as ever, narrowed her eyes. "This is not the time for sentimental farewells," she snapped. "She has stolen from the royal family, and now she must face the consequences. There is no time for this nonsense." But before anyone could respond, Prince Olumide stepped forward, his heart aching at the sight of Ada in front of him. His fists were clenched at his sides, and his entire body was trembling with emotion. "Please." His voice was hoarse, his face pale with shock. He had seen the earth begin to cover her, and now she was asking for one last moment with the person she loved most. His heart tore at the thought. Let her go to her mother. Just for a moment, she deserves that much. The prince's words hung in the air like a heavy weight. He was desperately trying to hold on to something, anything that could give him a sense of control over this nightmare. His heart broke at the thought of Ada's innocence, of her life being stolen away from her by a cruel fate and a group of jealous women. The king, who had been silent until now, looked at his son with sorrow in his eyes. He knew what this meant. The law had been broken and there was no way back. She has been condemned. The king's voice was soft but firm. The law is the law, Olumide. We cannot make exceptions. But the prince didn't move. His eyes were locked on Ada's face, filled with fear, with sorrow, with pleading. His heart shattered as he saw the hopelessness in her eyes. I can't let her die without seeing her mother one last time, he whispered, his voice barely audible. Please, father, please, let her see her mother. For a moment there was silence. The queen's face hardened and the elders exchanged unsure glances. It was against the law, but they could see the prince's pain. After a long, painful pause, the king sighed, his voice heavy with sorrow. "Fine. You may go with her, but make it quick. The law must be upheld." The prince didn't wait for further approval. He immediately turned to Ada, his eyes soft with grief and empathy. He took her hand gently, feeling the warmth of her trembling fingers in his. "Come with me," he whispered, his voice breaking as he helped her stand. As Ada walked toward the village, her heart beat faster with every step. She was going to see her mother, one last time. Her mother, the only family she had ever known. The woman who had raised her, loved her, and who had never once turned her back on her. The woman she would never see again. The prince stayed close to her, walking beside her, his presence a small comfort in the face of the unimaginable pain she was experiencing. Ada had always tried to hide her emotions, always tried to be strong, but now the floodgates were open. "Please, don't let me die without saying goodbye." Her voice was barely a whisper, but the words cut through the prince's heart like a knife. "I won't let you go, Ada," he said softly. "You are not going to die. I will find a way to save you." But deep down, he knew that he was powerless to stop the law. His heart broke at the thought of what was about to happen to her. As they reached the small cottage at the edge of the village, Ada's heart ached in ways she had never known. This was it, the last time she would see her mother. The last time she would walk through the doors of their little home. The door creaked open, and Mama Titi was sitting in her usual place by the window, humming softly, lost in the peaceful world she had created for herself. She didn't know what was coming. She couldn't see the prince standing by her side, or the tears in her daughter's eyes. "Mama," Ada whispered, her voice breaking. "It's me. It's Ada." Mama Titi turned her head slightly, a smile crossing her face even though she couldn't see her daughter. "Ada, my dear, I've missed you. I've been waiting for you to come back. I've been praying for your safety." Tears streamed down Ada's face as she knelt beside her mother, her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. "Mama, She choked on the words, unsure of how to explain what was happening, unsure of how to say goodbye. "I don't want to leave you." Ada sobbed, her body shaking with grief. "I've done nothing wrong, Mama, I swear it. But they've condemned me." Mama Titi smiled warmly as though she had never heard the weight of Ada's words. "You've always been such a good girl, Ada. Don't be afraid. Whatever happens, know that I love you." The prince stepped forward, his face full of sorrow as he gently placed a hand on Ada's shoulder. "I am so sorry, Ada. I wish I could do more. I wish I could save you." Ada turned to him, her eyes filled with both gratitude and despair. "Thank you. Thank you for being kind to me. You've given me more than I could have ever asked for." And then, with tears in her eyes, Ada looked back at her mother. "Mama, I'm sorry. I won't be able to stay, but I will always be with you. Always." The small cottage was filled with the soft hum of the wind as it brushed through the window. But in the midst of that calm, a storm of sorrow had taken hold of Ada's heart. Her knees were pressed against the cold floor as she knelt beside her blind mother, who sat with her head slightly tilted, a warm smile still resting on her lips. The prince stood behind them, his presence quiet but heavy with grief. He had never imagined that things would turn out this way. Ada's life, full of hope and hard work, was now slipping away before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Ada's tears fell in silent streams, but they were not the tears of surrender. They were the tears of someone who loved, who cherished everything they had ever known. Her mother, her life, her dreams. All of it was about to be taken away. "Mama!" Ada cried, her voice trembling as she clutched her mother's hands. "I don't want to leave you. I can't leave you." "I've always been by your side, and now they're taking me away from you. I'm so sorry." Mama Titi's face softened, her hands gently cupping Ada's cheeks, though she couldn't see the tears that stained her daughter's face. "You are my heart, Ada. she whispered, her voice gentle but filled with sorrow. "I have always known that you would do great things, but no matter what happens, my dear, you will always be with me." Ada's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She wanted to scream, to tell her mother that she wasn't ready to go, that she couldn't leave her alone. But the truth was, Ada knew she had no choice. The law had already been passed and her fate was sealed. "I love you, Mama," Ada sobbed, her voice barely audible through the weight of her tears. "I love you so much. Please know that." Mama Titi's trembling hands moved to stroke Ada's hair, her fingers brushing through it as though trying to memorize every moment of her daughter's presence. She was losing her, and the pain of it was more than she could bear. "Ada!" Mama Titi's voice cracked, her sorrow too great to hide. "My heart can't bear this. I can't bear to lose you." At that moment, the prince stepped forward, his heart aching at the pain in both of their eyes. He didn't know what to say, didn't know how to help. Ada had given him everything, her trust, her friendship, her heart, and now he couldn't save her. He felt so powerless, so small in the face of such injustice. "I'm so sorry, Ada," the prince said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I've tried, but I couldn't protect you." Ada's hand reached out to him, a faint, broken smile crossing her face despite the crushing weight of her sorrow. I know, Your Highness. You've done all you could. You've been kind to me when no one else was." She turned back to her mother, her tears flowing freely now. "Thank you for everything. I'll never forget you, Mama." At that moment, the door to the cottage creaked open, and the cold, unmistakable sound of guards' boots echoed through the house, breaking the fragile silence. A voice from the doorway spoke, the final words, "It's time." The words sent a chill through Ada's spine. It was over. The guards had come to take her away, and there was no more time for words, no more time for anything. Her mother's hands trembled violently as she reached out to Ada, pulling her close, pressing her cheek against her daughter's in a desperate, final embrace. "Please, Ada, don't go. Don't leave me here alone. I can't live without you. I'll die without you." The anguish in Mama Titi's voice was almost unbearable, a heart-wrenching cry of a mother losing everything. Her world was crumbling. The sound of her sobbing filled the small room, her cries so raw, so desperate, that they echoed in the prince's ears, piercing his heart. Ada felt her mother's pain like a dagger in her chest, and in that moment, she realized how much she would never get to do. She would never be able to take care of her mother again. She would never feel her mother's arms around her, the warmth of her embrace, the softness of her voice. "I can't leave you, Mama. I can't," Ada sobbed, her voice breaking into anguished cries. "Please, don't make me leave you. I'll stay. I'll fight. Please, Mama." But there was no fighting left to do. The guards moved closer, their faces hard and cold. Time was running out. Ada turned to the prince, her eyes pleading, filled with desperation. "Please, do something. You promised me, Prince Almighty. You promised me you'd protect me." Her hands reached out toward him, hoping for something, anything, to change. The prince's face was filled with deep sorrow, his chest tightening as he watched Ada's pain. His voice cracked, and for the first time, he realized how powerless he truly was. "I'm sorry, Ada. I failed you." His words were like a knife in his heart. Just then, Mama Titi collapsed into her daughter's arms, her face streaked with tears. Her soul was breaking. "Ada, my heart. I cannot lose you. If they take you from me, I will die too." Her voice was raw with the kind of sorrow only a mother knows when faced with losing their child. Ada kissed her mother's forehead gently, holding her close one last time. "I love you, Mama. I will never forget you." The prince reached for Ada's hand, his eyes full of anguish. He had failed. There was nothing left but to watch her walk to her death. The guards stepped forward, their cold hands pulling Ada from her mother's arms. Mama Titi screamed in anguish, as though the very core of her being was being ripped apart. Her cries filled the room, the pain so overwhelming it seemed to freeze time itself. "No, no," Mama Titi wailed, her arms reaching out as though she could somehow stop them from taking her daughter. "Please, don't take her. Take me instead." Ada was forced to walk away from her mother's outstretched arms, but she couldn't bring herself to turn her back on her. Her heart was breaking, knowing she would never see her mother again, never get to hold her hand or feel the comfort of her gentle voice. As the guards pulled her out of the cottage, Ada looked back one last time. She saw her mother's broken face, her sobs racking her fragile body, and in that moment, Ada's soul shattered. "I love you, Mama," Ada shouted, her voice filled with the kind of grief no one should ever feel, and with that final cry, the guards led her away, the world falling away with each step. The air grew colder as Ada was dragged toward the burial pit, her body moving like it was no longer her own. The harsh reality of what was happening was too much for her to bear, but there was nothing left to do. The guards' grip on her wrists was firm, and their eyes were cold, showing no hint of compassion. The voices of the crowd, which had gathered to watch her fate unfold, blurred in Ada's mind. All she could hear were the desperate cries of her mother, fading away in the distance as the world around her seemed to close in. "Please, Ada, please don't go." The cries from Mama Titi echoed in her ears, but they felt like they belonged to someone else now. It was too late. Ada's heart ached in a way that words could never explain. She was leaving behind the one person who had always loved her unconditionally, and she would never see her again. The pain of the moment felt as though it would swallow her whole. Her eyes were blurry with tears, but she saw the pit ahead of her, the place of her death, the place where the earth would consume her. As the guards reached the edge of the pit, Ada fell to her knees, her body trembling as she tried to speak, to fight for her life, but her voice was caught in her throat. "No, please, not like this." The words barely escaped her lips, but the guards paid her no attention. They tossed her into the pit. The cold, hard ground below her was unforgiving. Ada's body hit the earth with a sickening thud, but it was nothing compared to the sickness that churned in her heart. With the earth now surrounding her, Ada's breath came in sharp, painful gasps. The reality of her fate settled on her chest like a weight that she could not escape from. The law had taken her life, and there was no way out. She could feel the dirt already starting to pile on top of her, the weight of the earth suffocating her. But in that moment, Ada gathered all her strength, all the love she had ever known, all the pain she had carried through her life, and she did what she had never dared to do before. With what little breath she had left, Ada raised her voice, her words filled with rage and heartbreak. "Let the earth take me, but mark my words," she shouted, her voice echoing through the courtyard. "This land will never know peace again. The innocent will suffer as I have suffered. The heavens will curse this kingdom for what it has done. You will all pay for this injustice." The words seemed to come from deep within her, a final cry for justice, for the truth to be heard even if she wouldn't be around to witness it. "I curse this land. May the blood of the innocent forever haunt the rulers who do not care for their people. May this kingdom never know peace. May sorrow follow its kings, and may the earth remember the wrongs done today." The crowd stood frozen, not knowing whether to be moved by her curse or to stand in silence. Ada's voice, raw with pain, carried through the air, and, for a brief moment, it felt as though time itself had stopped. The prince, who had been standing off to the side, watched in broken silence as the final moments of Ada's life were being taken away from her. He had promised to protect her, but he had failed. There was nothing he could do now. His heart ached, his throat tight with unshed tears. He had lost her, and now he would be haunted by the weight of this curse, knowing that the woman he had come to care for, no, the woman he had come to love, was gone. As Ada's voice faded into the cold air, the first shovels of dirt were tossed into the pit, burying her body, but not her spirit. The earth consumed her, but her curse remained. Far from the royal courtyard, in the small cottage, Mama Titi's cries could be heard for miles. She had already been told what had happened. Her daughter was dead, buried in the earth. The weight of the loss was too much for her. Her heart was shattered. Her life, once filled with hope for Ada's future, had crumbled in an instant. She could hear the voice of her daughter even now, whispering in her mind, calling out to her from the beyond. "I love you, Mama. I will never leave you." With her heart broken and no reason to go on, Mama Titi screamed in agony, her voice raw and filled with anguish as she stood by the window, staring at the empty sky. "Take me too," she cried out into the heavens, her hands reaching for the sky as though asking the world to take her life in place of Ada's. "Take me instead." Her voice cracked as she fell to her knees, the sorrow that gripped her soul too strong for her fragile body to bear. Back at the burial site, the royal family watched as the last of Ada's body was consumed by the earth. The crowd began to disperse, and the guards stood at attention, their faces unmoving. But the atmosphere in the palace had changed. The curse Ada had spoken carried with it a weight that none of them could ignore. The prince stood at the edge of the pit, his face pale and filled with sorrow. He had failed her. He had promised Ada that he would protect her, and now she was gone. He could hear the echo of her curse in his mind, and he knew that there would be no peace for him, no peace for the kingdom, until justice was served. The curse was not just Ada's last words, it was a promise that the wrong done to her would one day return to those who had caused it. The earth would remember. As the prince walked away from the pit, his mind was filled with thoughts of revenge, but not the kind of revenge Ada had cursed upon the kingdom. His revenge would be justice. He would make sure the truth came out, and those responsible would pay. As the earth swallowed Ada's body, her voice still echoed in the minds of all who had witnessed her tragic end. The kingdom now stood at a crossroads. A curse had been cast, and the echoes of Ada's final words would reverberate through the land, changing the fate of everyone in the royal palace. The prince's heart burned with the need for revenge, and the queen, the king, and the maids would soon face the consequences of their actions. Justice would come, but at what cost? Watch out for part 2 of Ada's story. The land will never be the same, and the battle for truth and vengeance will ignite a storm that no one can escape.